Welcome to Healing Childhood Trauma, the podcast for millennial women who are ready to heal from the past. Here, we have the deeper discussions on emotional well-being and practical tips that will empower you to transform your relationships and underlying anxiety from insecure to secure attachment. I'm Lizandra, your host and psychotherapist. I'm a little bit obsessed with human development, deep conversations, and finding the lesson even in the most challenging of circumstances. I'm very happy to have you with me on this journey of self-discovery where we unpack the past and heal in the present. I hope you are doing really well. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode, which I'm going to focus on childhood trauma because as this is a podcast which is based on childhood trauma, I realised that I haven't really defined what childhood trauma actually is. And so that's what I'm going to do on today's episode. So if you have been feeling confused about whether your experiences would be classed as childhood trauma or not, or maybe you feel that childhood trauma perhaps is too big of a word for you, maybe if you listen to this episode and the key things that make up childhood trauma will help you to get some clarity and also some validation for you and your healing. When many of my clients start therapy and we get into childhood trauma, and the reason why we get into childhood trauma fairly early within the process is because we understand a lot about ourselves and how we see our views of the world and our experiences through our previous experiences. And we learn a lot about how we have our thought patterns, how we process information, how we have relationships and how we feel about ourselves as a result of our childhood experiences. And so if you're coming to therapy now as an adult, it's also really useful for us to get the context of where you've come from, which makes up the kind of person that you are today. And so one of the ways that I work is because I'm an integrative therapist, and that basically means that I'm trained in different approaches in order to help with psychological difficulties or emotional difficulties. And one of the modalities that I'm trained in is called psychodynamic therapy. And psychodynamic therapy is basically looking at what your childhood experiences are and the developmental stages of your childhood and how that then impacts you if some of those developmental targets are not met or some of your needs are not met as a result of the things that you experience through the various different stages of your childhood and adolescence. And that tells you a lot about your ability to cope with stress and your resilience and perhaps some of the struggles that you might be experiencing as an adult that you might think is only related to what's going on in the moment. Maybe you are triggered by something around work stress, for example, or you might be triggered by something that's happening in your relationship or something that's happening in the family. And often the reason why you're being triggered by something in the present is often because it relates to something that you've already experienced in the past. And so for us to be able to understand more about how we can help you and how we can understand some of those patterns, that's why we go into, especially in a first therapy session, we tend to go into what your childhood experiences was like and also the significant relationship. So what was your relationship like with your mum, with your dad, with any siblings, with your family of origin, and also getting into context what your cultural background is, because that also will definitely play a part on your views and perceptions of the world and how you kind of functioned as a family. I hear a very typical thing from clients when they come to therapy when asked about their childhood. And I'll, just ask the question of, so tell me a little bit about your childhood experiences and what that looked like. And I will often get back a comment along the lines of, well, my childhood was really normal. And in a sense, that's right, because it's normal to you. But then we have to kind of look deeper and unpack that and really evaluate, well, okay, what is normal? What would you consider to be normal? And very often, if somebody has had, or if they are coming to therapy and they are having issues with feeling out of control with their emotions, or they have really high anxiety, or they have issues with like setting boundaries with family, or relationship issues that they have been having a lot of conflict and they've been finding it difficult to resolve that conflict in their relationship. Most of the time you can trace that back to a lot of patterns that they've experienced in their childhood, and then it's starting to come out as an adult through different behavioural patterns of perhaps having dysfunctional communication, for example, or certain behaviours such as people pleasing and not being able to prioritise themselves or recognise when they need something in a relationship. And so when we look at this a little bit deeper and we think, okay, well, what is your idea of normal? They'll say, nothing much really happened, but, and then you'll hear the snippets of little bits of trauma starting to come in of, well, I would hear my mum and my dad fighting, for example, and sometimes it would get physical. And then they would kind of almost backtrack and minimize and say, oh, but I didn't actually see anything, as though the fact that they didn't actually physically witness the abuse would make it any less frightening or any less impactful or scary for a kid because they haven't actually seen it with their own eyes. Even though they can hear the noise, they can hear the disruption, they're not necessarily making that link that because it didn't directly happen to them, that it would still be a really difficult thing for a child to be in an environment where that is taking place. And they wouldn't necessarily describe it as trauma because they've kind of, in a lot of ways, had to normalize that for themselves in order for them to be able to cope with the emotional impact that something like that can have on you. And quite often you can end up minimizing or denying your own experiences just as a form of self-protection, of not wanting to admit that perhaps your parents got it wrong, or even just acknowledging the fact that something could be traumatic. It's not something necessarily that you would want to, it's not a club that you want to be part of. If you could choose that, you wouldn't choose that for yourself, right? It's something that happens to us, but it's not always something that we're in control of. And sometimes there can be an element of shame around that because we also really want to be very protective, understandably protective of our parents. And we don't always want to acknowledge, and it can be very hard and painful to admit that we didn't necessarily get the kind of upbringing that we would have needed, or the kind of emotional or physical support that we needed to have in order for us to be able to thrive and feel safe and feel loved and feel wanted as we're growing up. And obviously, life is not perfect. We all go through struggles, and so there are some things that can happen in your childhood that aren't necessarily classed as trauma. They may have been difficult experiences for you, as in you found it difficult to cope with, but it wouldn't necessarily be classed as childhood trauma. Some people say that childhood trauma is whatever you consider it to be. So if you find that something was traumatic for you, then it's okay to kind of validate that for yourself. And if you want to name it as childhood trauma, then that's your right to do so. But where that can be maybe minimizing or invalidating for some people are the people who have really experienced really significant trauma. And I think maybe that's also the reason why sometimes people are reluctant to say that, yes, I have experienced childhood trauma, because there's almost like this scale of, was it traumatic enough for it to be classed as trauma? And I think that's quite an interesting, nuanced conversation in itself to have. So one way that you can identify if you have experienced childhood trauma is based on a study that was done, which you might have heard of this, or it might be brand new information. But this study was done in San Francisco I believe it was done in the late 90s. So not all that long ago. Well, yeah, if you're a millennial, if you're my kind of age group, not so long ago. If you are younger, you happen to be younger listening to this episode, that might seem like a very long time ago. But for me, as a millennial, like the 90s was the other day, right? So they had this study, and the point of this study wasn't actually anything to do with childhood trauma. I believe the point of the study was to find something around weight loss and why certain people would find it challenging or difficult to lose weight. And it might have been like a big pharma kind of research project, trying to find like what are the things that stop people from being able to lose weight. And what they had discovered as a result of the findings of this study, everybody who was having trouble with losing weight also had links with other health conditions. And when they looked into that further, all of these health conditions were underpinned by them experiencing one or more instances of childhood trauma experiences. And so this study became known as the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it looks at the different points of childhood trauma that people can experience, which then also informs how they might also have other complications in relation to health, relationships, and chronic health conditions. If you want to, you can take this study online. I mean, there's probably things that you can Google, and you can bring up the questionnaire, which it's known as ACEs, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences questionnaire. So you can go and look that up if you want to, but it is not a requirement, of course. If you don't feel like it will be helpful for you, then give it a miss. But I'm going to name the 10 things here now so that you basically give yourself 1 point for each adverse childhood experience. So I will tell you what they are now. So 1 is whether or not you have experienced emotional abuse, recurrent emotional abuse. So that means it happening frequently, more than once, often. 2 is if you have also repeatedly experienced physical abuse. 3 is if you have experienced sexual abuse or sexual contact. 4 is if you've experienced physical neglect. 5 is if you have also experienced emotional neglect. 6 is whether or not you have experienced substance abuse in the home, so living with an alcoholic or perhaps with somebody who has an addiction. 7 is living with somebody who has mental illness, so somebody living with depression, or perhaps they've had a suicide attempt. 8 is if your mother has been treated violently. So that doesn't mean whether or not you've actually seen it or not with your own eyes. It's, are you aware, or did you have an awareness that your mother was treated with violence in the home? Or even if you weren't aware, did you find out later in life that your mother was treated with violence in the home? 9 is divorce or a parental separation. And 10 is criminal behaviour or a household member going to prison. And so for every one of those 10 points, it's a single point. And if you have experienced several points on this scale of this adverse childhood experiences scale, then it can make you susceptible to certain other experiences. The fact that you are listening to this podcast, it is very unlikely that you haven't experienced any of these things, right? So you've probably experienced at least one of these things. Although it's common, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's normal, but it definitely is common. And there's a difference between it being normal and it being common. Just because it's common doesn't mean that it's okay or that it's acceptable, but we just recognize that it happens a lot. In the original study, it found that it was about 67% of the population who had at least one of these adverse childhood experiences. And people who had 4 or more of these difficult experiences, it meant that they were 12.6% higher, more likely to develop cancer or heart disease. So it really shows you the impact of how childhood trauma isn't just about what happens to you and the emotional load that means for you, but there's also real health implications to you experiencing childhood trauma, especially if you add those traumas up and it's more experiences than just the 1 or 2 instances. It's a series of events, it's a series of things that you've experienced. And so if you do have a score of 4 and over, it's just to let you know that there's certain things that you might find more challenging than a person who has no adverse childhood experiences. And so sometimes when you start to compare yourself to people who have been raised in homes where they have had that emotional support. They have had parents, even though it hasn't been a perfect childhood, they have felt supported enough to be able to thrive and to be able to have their needs met in a way where their nervous system was able to feel regulated, because they were regulated by the emotions of the adults around them. And so if you haven't had that experience, if you have experienced trauma, and then you always kind of compare yourself to people who have never experienced trauma, and then you wonder why, you find work really tough, or you struggle with anxiety, and why does like the most simplest thing or the most basic of things make you feel like you're going into a fight with a lion when you're literally just, shopping at the supermarket and it's not a big deal. It's because all of these experiences, they impact you in ways that are not always very obvious, but they can be very obvious in terms of what is happening within your body and within your nervous system and within how you respond to things. Which is why it's really important for people to, rather than minimize or deny that they've experienced childhood trauma, and kind of tell themselves that, it happened in the past, I should just get over it. The past matters. And whether or not it happened years ago, you are still probably living from the impact of those experiences. And so if you have experienced childhood trauma, you are so much more likely to develop chronic illness. You are much more likely to develop unhealthy patterns with alcohol or food. You're even more likely to smoke and have unhealthy coping techniques, because that's how you've had to learn to function. That's how you've had to learn how to cope. And again, I think it's another reason why it makes things like therapy such an important and integral part of your healing process, to be able to kind of counteract those difficult childhood experiences. And I've probably said this quote before, but we cannot be in control of what happened to us, but we have to be in control of our healing and how we then choose to move forward. But I also kind of want to give a message of hope, because just because you have experienced childhood trauma, that doesn't mean that these things will definitely happen to you and life will definitely be so much harder. There is always ways that you can find ways of growth and have post-traumatic growth as a result of what you've experienced. A lot of the time, what you've experienced actually makes you into the kind of person that you are today. And we don't need to have trauma in order for us to be able to learn good life skills and how to have, good human qualities. But there are things that we can learn as a result of our trauma. We can learn how to build our resilience. We can learn to problem solve. We can learn to empathize with people a lot more, because you've experienced things that you would never want anybody else to experience. In the struggle, there's also blessings that come from that struggle. So I hope that you can have some hope and know that having childhood experiences, difficult childhood experiences, doesn't define who you are, and it doesn't mean that life is hopeless for you. If you are a little bit of a book nerd and you like to go a little bit deeper and understand more about adverse childhood experiences, there is a book that I can recommend to you that I've been reading recently as well, and it is called The Deepest Well by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. And she's also got a really good TED Talk on YouTube that you can go and have a look at as well. So if maybe you don't want to read a whole book, it's a bit, it's not your thing, go and watch that YouTube video. I believe it may be 45 minutes or an hour, but that can also explain just a little bit more about childhood experiences. And the more that you kind of know about this stuff, the more that it empowers you to know, okay, this is the way that I want to approach my healing. And so when you have control over that, and when you have agency and the knowledge around doing that, that is really empowering and part of the journey of you being able to kind of take more control of your destiny, and you being able to have more say in the trajectory of your life, because you do not have to be defined by trauma. There is definitely the potential for growth, and you are never too old to learn. Thank you for joining this episode of Healing Childhood Trauma. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and empowering. Remember, healing is a journey and you are not alone on this path. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. And you can share this episode with a friend. Your feedback helps this podcast to reach more women who are ready to heal and build secure, healthy relationships and heal from the past.